Good afternoon, and welcome to the session between East and West, where we turn from Levantine region to the expansive network that defined the Phoenician world across the Mediterranean. In this session, two prominent scholars will present their findings because our last talk was cancelled. Findings on the economic and cultural forces that shaped the Phoenician world. The first talk will be given by Professor Tzila Eshel from Haifa University. Professor Eshel is an archaeometallurgist. Her work focuses on metals in the Bronze and Iron Ages, with a particular attention to silver as a means of currency and exchange. She has published several influential papers. Okay. Professor Eshel is an archaeometallurgist. Her work focuses on metal in the Bronze and Iron Ages, with a particular attention to silver as means of currency and exchange. She has published several influential papers on the Phoenician quest for silver in the West Mediterranean and is currently excavating at Tel Akhwat. Her talk today will focus on metals and early Iron Age Mediterranean networks. Zila.
Thank you, Daphne, for presenting me. And I want to thank, as this is the last session, maybe in the name of all of us, Alex and Naama, for organizing this very interesting and multidisciplinary conference. And since it's such a multidisciplinary audience, I will start with the base, and my talk will be divided to two parts. First, I will give the base, and then I will give the next part will be to question some of the things I wrote in the past. So if it sounds familiar to you, bear with me the first 10 minutes.
Click one.
Click what's where?
Click with the mouse.
On the keyboard.
On the mouse. One click and then it should work.
Okay, great. So in Israel, over 40 silver hoards were unearthed in the last 100 years of archaeological excavations in different locations. And if the number of over 40 hoards doesn't sound a lot to you, it's a lot. In the whole Near East, we have 70 hoards, and 40 of them were found just in this small premises from different periods. So we have over 1,000 years of hoarding silver. And why was silver hoarded? Why is silver so interesting? Because it was used as a means of exchange, or actually ancient money, before the invention of coinage. We have silver hoards already in the 3rd millennium BC in Mesopotamia. And we find them here in the southern Levant from the 2nd millennium BC, and they were used as actually ancient money. The way they were used, if you look at how they look, this is actually silver ingots or cut ingots. In Hebrew, we call them betza kesef, and they were traded for their weight. And they were valued for their weight and not for their form. Sorry. So this makes silver very important for ancient economies. Another thing, introduction about silver, is that producing silver is quite a complicated process, and it involves two steps. The first step is smelting, in which lead ore is produced. And the second step is once you produce lead from a lead ore, is extracting the silver from the lead. And this second stage is called copulation. It was done in a small couple, a ceramic couple, in which the lead was actually sticking. It was heated and was sticking to the ceramics, and the silver could be collected. So this is important to us to understand the process, because in each piece of silver there is some amount of lead which is left over from the original ore. Now, this is lucky for us, because lead can be used for provenance. We use lead isotopes, which gives us a signature of the origin of the lead, where the silver is coming from, or the lead inside the silver. So if silver was produced in lead ores, we can use the isotopic signature of the lead in the silver to find where the silver came from. so we use this to say to trace the origins of the silver. Now this method, lead isotopes, works also for other metals, bronze, copper. Any metal that has lead in it can be traced for its source. When we're having this tool in mind and talking about the Phoenicians, a lot of times an interesting question that comes up for biblical people here is, where was biblical Tarshish? Now we know that Tarshish is described in the Bible as a place, or some people can explain it as the names of the ships, but some kind of a joint nautical venture of King Solomon with the king of Tyre, which did a very long trip, 3 years, bringing with it different things. And the first in the list is gold, but right after it is silver. And the question where biblical Tarshish was is a question that has been discussed quite widely. This is the Nora stone from Sardinia, having the word Tarshish on the top, and the Sheridan. And the other, of course, other suggestions have been made as well. And what is interesting is that we look at the sources of silver around the Mediterranean. Each one of them has its own little Tarshish. So in the Taurus Mountains, we have Tarsus. In the Aegean, we have Thasos. In Sardinia, we have Tharos. And in Iberia, Tartessos. So I'm not going to solve the mystery, where was biblical Tarshish, but the sources of silver go very nicely with this question. Sorry. So when we do lead isotopes on silver, we find that in the late Bronze Age, especially in the second half of the late Bronze Age, silver was coming from the Aegean, at least some of it, or actually from Greece, from the Laurion mines. We find it also in Cyprus. There's not a lot of silver in Cyprus, but these are two very famous silver ingots, which were found in Cyprus. The silver in them is coming from Lauria. And we find it also in the southern Levant, in Abel Bet Maacha. So this is the silver hoard from Abel Bet Maacha. And it's a nice proof that the Phoenicians knew how to sail around Africa. Even left us. It's a joke. It's a joke, okay? So the silver from Abel Bet Maacha, some of it falls on the ore fields of Lavrion. The yellow crosses here. So when you look at the isotopic graphs, what we do is we plot our lead isotopes of the items on the ores, and we compare them to each other. And so you see we have different results here. Not all of them fall on the Laurion mines, but at least one of the items may have been coming from Greece. But this doesn't hold on for a long time, because something happens between the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age 1, and it's what we call the late Bronze Age collapse. Now, what is exactly the late Bronze Age collapse? What collapsed? This is, of course, debatable, but at least we know that it affected very strongly trade routes and maritime trade routes. And surprisingly, maybe, is although this big dramatic thing happened, we still have quite a lot of silver hoards in the southern Levant during the Iron Age 1, coming from Tel Keisan, from Bet Shean, Megiddo, and Ashkelon. And they're quite large, you can see from the photos. And so the first thing we thought is maybe the late Bronze Age collapse didn't affect the sources of silver, or the flow of silver coming in. Now, why is it important to have a flow of silver? Because when you're using silver as your means of exchange, as your money, then you have to make sure you always have fresh silver coming in, because if not, then you run out of money. So it's not something that you can have a big batch coming once in a while. It has to be securely flowing in. And interestingly, what we found is that there is a lot of silver in the early Iron Age, but it's debased. It's mixed with copper. So if you look at this graph, you see silver from the late Bronze Age 3, just the transition from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age. We have between something like 70 or 60% copper in the silver. And then throughout the Iron Age, we have different amounts of copper in the silver, but still enriched with copper. And this ends in the Iron Age 2A, where finally the silver is now clean. Now, this is a logarithmic graph, so these are high percentages of copper in the silver. And it still looks like silver. So that's also an interesting question to ask. How come it still looks like silver? And you see it very interestingly here in Tel Kesan. The hoard looks like copper when you look at the corrosion, but when it's cleaned, it looks like silver. So they were adding just the right amount. If you look at the ternary here, they were adding they had a few techniques. Either they added just the right amount so it won't affect the color that much, or they were adding arsenic in the case of the hoard from Megiddo excavated by Eran Aryeh, or in Bet She'an, the hoard excavated by Ami Mazar, they had a copper core with silver around it, but different techniques, but the silver is mixed with copper. And this changes. Sorry, one more thing is when you want to do provenance and know where the silver is coming, it's complicated because the copper is also adding lead to the alloy. And so instead of getting the source of the silver, we get the source of the copper, or a mix of all these. And what we try to do is have some kind of mixing model to identify the end members. It doesn't really matter, but what you see here is Aegean or Anatolian silver on one end and copper on the other hand, and you see this nice mixing line showing that the copper from the Arava and the silver from the Aegean, if they mix, they give this isotopic signature. So the addition of copper actually affects the lead isotope analysis, and we don't really know where the silver was coming from in this period. But what we do know is that in the mid-10th century BCE, there's a big change. And this big change is represented by a very big and important hoard from Tel Dor. I don't know if you saw it yesterday in the Israel Museum, but it's there. And it contains over 8 kilos of silver in it, which is a lot. The silver is, you can see it's still in its original form. It's like bundled and wrapped with textiles and stamped by Bula. And this hoard is how I got to archaeology and how I got to Professor El Gilboa and where I started my career. And I was very interested in knowing where the silver was coming from. And when we did the lead isotope analysis to the silver from Tel Dor and another hoard from Akko, which is much smaller and also not securely dated, then we see that the silver comes from two different origins. One, here on the blue, Anatolia, okay, falling on the Taurus Mountains in Anatolia, and the other one, Iglesiente in Sardinia. So the silver hoard from Tel Dor contains silver from Anatolia and Sardinia. And when we saw that, we said, together with Professor Gilboa and Nama Yalomak, we said, this is the Phoenician pre-colonization. This is the first time Phoenicians are going out into the West Mediterranean. They're bringing silver back with them. And why is it pre-colonization? Because we don't have any evidence of Phoenicians in the mid-10th century in the Mediterranean. So first they brought the silver, and only then they decided to settle. And our story continues. In the 9th and 8th century, there's a lot of silver in the southern Levant. And the largest hoard from Eshtamoa is over 20 kilos of silver. And all this silver, or at least what was analyzed from it, and from additional sites, including Tel Arad, which I collaborated with Ido Koch and Professor Zev Herzog, which allowed me to analyze it. And all these hoards are containing silver from one origin, and it is all from Iberia. So you see the isotopic signature is different. We don't have Sardinia. We have maybe 2 dots in Anatolia, but all the silver is coming in from Iberia. So, and this fits very well with Phoenician early colonization in Iberia, which starts in in the early 9th century, maybe earlier, and fits very well with the Phoenician presence in Iberia. And this goes on for over 2 centuries, silver from Iberia coming in all the way to the southern Levant. And so this was the first part of my talk. And the second part, I want to revisit the Phoenician silver hoard in Tel Dor and ask, is this Phoenician pre-colonization? Professor Ayelet Gilboa, why am I asking this question? Let's first go back to Tel Dor and the pottery, from the perspective of pottery. So Professor Ayelet Gilboa has been excavating Tel Dor and publishing it for many years now. Described this process in one of her latest concluding papers, talking about the Iron Age 1, in which we have pottery from Egypt and Cyprus. So these are the major trading partners of Tel Dor. And in the Iron Age 2A, we see a change in which the imports from Cyprus and Egypt continue, but we have first evidence of Euboean and Cycladic pottery. So the Phoenicians who were trading mainly in the Iron Age 1 with Egypt and Cyprus are now expanding in some way to the West Mediterranean. The context of the Tel Dor hoard, it was found below what the excavators called platforms, something very wide and thick, and below it was a floor, and below this floor was the hoard, under the floor, which is where we expect to find silver hoards. But on the floor above it, there was as described by Ayelet, an important assemblage of apparently in situ Cypro-geometric vessels and an Euboean mid-late proto-geometric fragment. Another interesting thing about the silver from Tel Dor is that it was mixed with gold, which is something very extraordinary for silver, because gold is usually valued more than silver. So why would someone mix gold into his silver? And there's only one place that I can think of where silver might have been valued more than gold, and that is Egypt. So maybe this gives us another connection, possibly to Egypt, but it's just a hinge. So what do we know about Phoenicians in Anatolia? If the silver is coming from Anatolia, and if this is pre-colonization, what do we know about Phoenicians in Anatolia? Well, actually not much. Phoenician pottery in the 10th century in Cilicia is quite scarce, and this is from a paper by Gunnar Lehmann. The earliest Phoenician inscriptions, and correct me, all the experts here if I'm wrong, are later. And at all, in general, Phoenician presence in Anatolia throughout the Iron Age is not very strong, while Cypriots have quite strong connections with Anatolia. We do have the Anatolian beehives in Tel Rehov, which exactly the bees in the beehives at Tel Rehov are coming from Anatolia. Now, if you want to have bees from Anatolia in Tel Rehov, it's not enough. It's like silver. It's not enough to have one shipment. You have to continue on bringing on the bees because they don't breed. So there was some connection for Anatolia, and this is, I think, the strongest evidence we have for it, at least today. So what do we know about Phoenicians in Sardinia? There's one site in Sardinia called Saint Imbenia, which we visited with the late Professor Marco Rendelli. And what's special about Saint Imbenia is that it's a Nuragic local site which went through a change in the late 10th, early 9th centuries. A Nuragic site means that you have a big tower here, which is your Nurag, and you have the local houses. And what they did is they changed the way that their village was constructed, and they built a big piazza in the middle of it. And in this piazza, we have evidence of trade. So they adapted to trade. But this is not a colony of Phoenicians. It's a place in which we find Phoenician ceramics, a few tuyeres, and some mixed Phoenician nuragic material culture. So this is maybe some connection of Phoenicians in Sardinia. Actually, the Phoenician presence in Sardinia is much later than the Phoenician presence in Iberia. So what else do we know about Sardinia? We know that Sardinia held very, very close connections with Cyprus throughout the late Bronze Age. And this is the oxide ingot, which was mentioned in regard to Carthage. This is what an oxide ingot looks like. And actually, Cyprus was producing oxide ingots in the late Bronze Age, and there were quite a lot of them found, or fragments of them found in Sardinia. We also have pottery, nuragic pottery in Cyprus in the late Bronze Age. So in the late Bronze Age, Sardinia and Cyprus were very tightly connected with each other. We also have lead from Sardinia in the Carmel Coast in the late Bronze Age, together with copper from Cyprus and tin possibly from Great Britain. So we have a very active metal trade in the late Bronze Age, activated probably or definitely had a very important part in it were the Cypriots. Now there's an argument, and we have also lead in Egypt, in Kantir, coming all the way from Sardinia. So, and there's more evidence, I didn't bring it all. But there's an argument going on about Sardinia in the late Bronze Age. There's discussions about how people from Cyprus reached Sardinia, how they sailed, what was the relationship between Sardinia and Cyprus, and how long did this go on? Did the late Bronze Age collapse, which stopped Cypriot metals from coming to the Levant, did this affect the circuit between Cyprus and Sardinia, or did this circuit continue going on also during the early Iron Age? So this is what's happening in the Mediterranean. When we go to the southern Levant and we look in the southern Levant, what happened, we have a totally different picture. We have copper from the Arava all over. So if in the late Bronze Age, copper was coming in from Cyprus, now there's very extensive copper production in Timna and Feinan. This is Timna Slaves Hill, very active throughout the early Iron Age, and producing copper, which we find all over the southern Levant. So every site we go through in the early Iron Age and we provenance the copper, it's coming from the Arava. So there's an extensive production of copper in the Arava. But and this is and we also have this is the ongoing work of Professor Naama Elomak, also provenancing copper throughout the southern Levant, and not only copper artifacts, but also copper bronze working sites. So in the southern Levant, throughout the early Iron Age, we have bronze working almost everywhere. And recently at El Akhwat, a site which I'm excavating, we have also evidence for bronze working in a volume that has not been found in any other site. So if previously this was identified as Naama calls it, from production anatomy to centralization, if the production of bronze was in small scale in the different sites during the Iron Age, in El Akhwat we have something very large scale going on. We have bronze and copper all over the site, and the bronze in it we find slag, which teaches us about the activity of what they were doing at El Akhwat. They were producing bronze from copper in very large quantities. But this does not end in the southern Levant. We have evidence that the copper from the Arava was reaching outside of the southern Levant. We have copper from the Arava in Arabia, we have copper from the Arava in Egypt, and we have copper from Arava in Greece in the early Iron Age. And this gives us an indication that copper was not only produced, but it was being mobilized. And the question is, there are two questions here, is when was this happening, and who was trading with the copper, and what does this have to do with the trade with the silver? So I won't go into the details because I think my talk was long enough, but all this evidence of copper from outside of the southern Levant is not very accurately dated. If we look in Phoenicia, we have copper in Sidon and in Beirut coming from the Arava, but you don't have to put on your glasses because this is how it was published. The pictures are not clear, the isotopes are not well seen, and we don't have a good resolution, not of the dates and not of the contexts. We have in Egypt copper from the Arava. This is actually very accurate, very well dated from the second half of the 11th century. And throughout the 10th century, we have copper from the Arava. In Taima, in the Arabian Peninsula, we have copper. And actually, someone once told me, everywhere you look, you found copper in the Arava. And if you don't find it in other places, it's because they didn't look for it. So the southern Levant becomes a center of very large volume of copper production and export. And of course, Olympia and Greece, where we have tripods from Arava copper, their date is based on topology of the tripod. So again, we don't know very good how to date when this is happening. So to conclude my talk, in the 10th century, we have a commercial revival in the southern Levant. And we know that the Phoenicians, who were trading mainly with Egypt and Cyprus, expand connections to the Aegean. But the silver is coming from Sardinia and Anatolia, which has long-lasting connections with Cyprus and not with and not evident. We don't have evidence of Phoenicians in these sites. So my question is, who were the commercial agents who brought the silver to Tel Dor, and who were the commercial agents who spread the copper to the different regions? And I think the chronology can help resolve this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tzila, for this wonderful, excellent talk. And we do have a few minutes for questions.
It's not a question, it's just a comment. It's on the Phoenician inscriptions in southeastern Turkey. We actually have quite a number of them. And we have an abundance of bilinguals, including a rather recent one just finally published from Ifriz. We now have hieroglyphic part of the that already goes with the Phoenician. So when you add them up, you have somewhere, depending on how you're talking about in terms of size of inscription, but you're talking something like 9 or 10 major inscriptions.
When, in which period?
Over 3 centuries.
One of the earliest ones.
9th century, 8th, 7th,
So
including a legal document.
So that's exactly the point I'm saying, is that we don't have anything from the 10th century, and this is a silver hoard from the 10th century.
Okay, I'm not disagreeing with that. That's not what I'm disagreeing with. What I'm trying to just modify is the tendency to say there isn't any Phoenician presence in the region. I would rather imagine that it's so the inscriptions show that there's a much larger presence than what we might typically think.
I fully agree with you. I was specifically talking about early Phoenician presence in there. Thank you for clarifying that.
Norma. Make me run. Sorry. Thank you so, turned on? Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you so much, Tzila. That was really great. I have a question. Because metals were often, very often, melted down and reused, is there a fingerprint? Does it leave a fingerprint when you're examining something, whether perhaps this has been melted down and reused? Is it a combination of different artifacts from different sources. I mean, is this going to confuse the picture that you're trying to build up?
Okay, so thank you for that question. I didn't go into the details, but I will go back for a minute and show you. When we do, can you go back here? Wait just a minute. Okay. When we do provenance, we actually get a lot, we take quite a few items and sample them. And what we get is quite a few results. And then if we look, for example, on the silver from Tel d'Or, I gave them different colors. Okay, so I have an end member here in Anatolia, and I have an end member here in Sardinia, and have a lot of dots falling in the middle between them. I call that a mixing line. They're actually a mix between Anatolian silver and Sardinian silver. And there might have been also another source of silver falling in the middle, but I wouldn't know it because it falls on my mixing line. So I only know what my end members are. That's the most I can get is two results. I can't get more than that in this method.
So does that give you a hint that it has been melted down from something else, or simply perhaps different sources have been combined?
It gives me a good indication that there was mixing going on. So this is not artifacts as they came from the ores, but some of them weren't mixed, or were mixed with Anatolian silver only, and some of them weren't mixed, and most of them were mixed. So I have to have a large a pool of samples in order to get to my end members.
Thank you very much.
Another question? Yaniv?
Thank you for your panoramic view. I just want to ask a very small question on one detail in one slide. Can you show the Cantir slide?
Canteen?
Cantir.
Cantir, yes. Sorry, I ran through it.
Okay. Cantir. On the left side, what do we see here?
Lead net weights.
Fishing weights.
For fishing nets.
Yeah, this is very important because, you know, I recently identified one from Mount Ebal, the one with the famous inscriptions. Oh. So this is a proof for the Exodus. From Mount Ebal from Cantir. Cantir is Piramesa, isn't it? Which the Israelites, the Hebrews built. So here we have a proof.
Thank you.
Sorry, see, like, can you show where Cantir is on the Egyptian?
It's what's called P. Ramesses.
Oh,
It's
so it's
a-
right on or in the delta.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you very much for this interesting paper that you presented. This is not exactly my field, but I have a question about Tel d'Or hoard. Can you-
What do you want to see, the hoard itself?
The hoard, the jar with the remains of the hoard.
Where was it?
Yeah.
Going the wrong way. These are the slides I didn't show you. Sorry. Here it is. Yes.
Beforehand, no, it was another slide.
You want to see the
That's on
bula?
the side.
Okay. I'm going again the wrong way.
This
This.
one. Here on the pieces, on the broken pieces from the hoard, it looks like parts of broken objects. They were like small ingots.
These are
or-
clay bula. They're not
Ah.
made of silver, and they were used
Okay.
probably to stamp the bundles.
Okay, and the copper, the silver itself, it was like chunks of silver.
Yeah, it looks like all the silver from all the other hoards. It's just pieces. Sometimes we find a piece of jewelry here and there, but it's ingots and cut ingots, different sizes.
That was I confused with these patterns.
Yeah, they're very interesting patterns, which I don't know to explain. They're apparently Middle Bronze Age patterns on the Iron Age bula, but that's a different story.
I have a question on the relative value of the silver versus gold, and I'll have to explain the biblical motivation for the question. It's a curious fact that was noted by my late teacher, Abu Hurwitz, that in biblical Hebrew, we have fixed order of certain word pairs. And usually gold is matched with silver. And the rule of the game is that the more important item comes first. And the curious fact is that in First Temple Hebrew, or what we think is First Temple Hebrew, silver precedes gold. So it's silver and gold. So it seems that silver is more expensive. But in Second Temple period, so Persian period onwards, it becomes gold and then silver. Does this have any basis in the commercial and economic system of the southern Levant?
When we look at Ugarit, for example, trade written evidence, gold is more valued than silver. We find it also in El Amarna, gold is more valued than silver. But we do know that the silver-gold ratio changes between Ugarit and Egypt, for example. So there's a difference there. But gold is more valued than silver.
Throughout the period.
That I know.
But not in Egypt.
But in Egypt, it might be different. Okay, but I don't know. In El Amarna, I'm not sure. Okay, here.
Right, because Egypt has access to gold mines, right? So silver was much more valuable because gold was so plentiful.
Yeah.
Want me to say it again?
Yeah.
In the Syrian text too, gold
Yeah.
is also always listed before silver, and then bronze.
So should I say it again or?
Maybe it's only,
you're
maybe
right?
it's only linguistic.
What about the electron?
No word for that. But I know.
Thank you.
Actually, I
Sila.
have a question.
Okay, so this would be the last one, okay?
Okay. Thank you, this was amazing. But I'm wondering for the 10th century, right? You showed locations where, I guess it was the copper that traveled out. And then presumably the silver is coming back. I mean, why, it sounded like from your presentation, you expected there to be a Phoenician presence at the basically like the silver mines or near the silver mines. Why couldn't it have been a similar scenario where it's trade first and then you don't need to set up a colony, you can just trade, show up, make exchanges, go home. That leaves a much smaller imprint than, you know, establishing just as it was in Spain and all over the Mediterranean.
Exactly the point. Well, first of all, it's possible, and it's what I thought when I studied the Dorherd in the beginning. But what happened in Spain is exactly not the case. In Spain, they produced silver, and they decided to stay there, and they established colonies in Spain because of the large amounts of silver available to them in Spain.
But it's a matter of phasing. I mean, my understanding, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the article, but it's the whole like, you know, trade precedes colonization.
Yeah, but I agree with you. But why did they continue onwards from Sardinia to Spain? Why did they not just produce silver in Anatolia? Why did they have to go all the way to Spain?
I mean, that's a different question, but I mean, you know better than I. Maybe the mines tapped out. There was local resistance. I mean, who knows the why? But you've proven that, right? That clearly that because later on in a later phase, clearly the silver is coming from Spain, and they have colonized.
So you like my first theory, okay?
I love all of your data.
כן, איילת.
Okay, last one. Go ahead.
I would like to maybe clarify something. Sardinia, and still knows better than I, Sardinia's mines are not something to write home about. So Sardinia was not could not have been a long-lasting source. So this, the difficult point is why isn't there Anatolian silver coming anymore? Because this is the nearest source, and as we all know, there are the inscriptions around 800. There's no correlation between the date of the inscriptions and the Anatolian silver. When you have the inscription, already the silver here is Iberian. That doesn't work.
Right.
Something,
Well,
there must have
perhaps,
been a reason why they
yeah.
stopped bringing silver from Anatolia, but at least to the southern Levant. Another thing we all have to understand that Silla sampled southern Levantine silver only. Whether this is the picture was the same all over, who knows?
We don't know yet.
May I respond?
I'm sorry, but
We'll
we need to continue, so I suggest that we will continue in the later session when we have a discussion. And I would like to thank again Tzila and to invite Dr. Paula Weinman-Barak from Tel Aviv University. Dr. Weinman-Barak is an archaeologist and ceramic specialist and the head of the ceramic petrography laboratory, where she leads analytical research, develops methodological frameworks, and trains students and visiting scholars in archaeometric approaches to ceramics. She combines petrography, FTIR spectroscopy, and regional geology to reconstruct ancient production practices and trade networks across the Mediterranean. Her talk today is entitled From Coastal Trust to Imperial Engine. Please, Paula.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Let's start. Most of you, all of you know this. It's an old idea rooted in the Bronze Age to produce a ceramic vessel. Yes, of course. It's an old idea in the Bronze Age to produce a ceramic vessel designated to ship goods overseas. These vessels were found everywhere, and they raised interest everywhere they were found, possibly because they were so foreign to the rest of the assemblages outside. Therefore, there were so many groups that dedicated their time. This is only a partial list of the provenance analysis, petrography, and others done to these vessels, trying to figure out who made them, who delivered them. And one of the patterns that emerged from that is very obvious, obviously. They were found in harbors, and they were also produced in harbors throughout the Levant. Specifically, 3 different regions within the late Bronze Age: the southern coast, the Carmel coast up to the Akko Bay, and then northern Syria. All of the Phoenician, our Phoenician is really absent from the province. Another pattern that emerged, not so obvious, but is consistent repeatedly over and over again, and even in the shipwreck, even from the little of what was published from the Uluburung, is that there is no specific site or region that is connected to a specific harbor. Each consumer site, if you want, had many different jars from many different locations. Repeatedly, the Shefela, the Carmel Coast, and the Syrian is represented together all over the place. What's different about it is the ratios. And since we are not talking with statistics, we really don't have enough data, so we will leave it aside for now. Inspired from this Bronze Age activity, many years ago, with Ayelet as my teacher, I decided to study the post-collapse war, early Iron Age at Tel Dor. And my PhD covered several areas, but the heart of it was these jars, the early Iron Age jars. And of course, we know them. We know them from Cyprus, and we know them from Egypt, not with provenance analysis, but from, of course, the shape is very, very familiar. And I was really surprised when I started to analyze them, or maybe not surprised because I had no expectations, except for hoping to find vast trade connections within these jars, and all I found is local production. And at first I was a bit disappointed, but considering what was available around Ord and not so many settlements at this period, maybe this was to be expected. While being disappointed and submitting the PhD, I missed one of the main things. I've missed the reality of the capacities and their function and how they are founded though. These jars were produced anywhere from a 5-liter bottle, something you can throw on a fishing boat and go out for a day, to a 30-liter jar. In vessels that once filled were very difficult, if even possible, to move at all. Sometimes I miss the obvious. And I really didn't know what to do with this data. Oh, and of course, every single possible capacity in between. There is no way to standardize these vessels. We have every single one I've measured had a little bit of a variation within it. Together with this reality of production, these shapes, this maritime shape adapted for transport ships, but possibly used for many, many other functions, we also know we can put it in the broader context of this very early Iron Age phase door, where Ayelet identified many years ago Cypriot style vessels produced at door, and Ayelet suggested produced by Cypriot potters. Together with that, also very famously known is the Egyptian imports. There are so many of them, well published, telling a story of connections really outside, not so much inside. There are some exceptions. A few jars arrived to Megiddo, some from Megiddo arrived to Dor, different shapes. But that's not the core of the story. When I'm looking at this data today, I still cannot say what language the people of Dor spoke. Was it a West Semitic language? Was it Greek? Was it Egyptian? Was it a mixture of all, like we can see in many other immigrant societies? I really don't know. I would, however, interpret this differently today. I would say that this tendency of producing this one shape fits all in a site tells everything about the maritime identity of the inhabitants. Later on at Dor, this shape is no longer being produced. Other things happen. We have this one cargo found at the waters of Dor many years ago. It wasn't produced at Dor, it was imported from the Akko Bay. Other jars are known from Kasile, Keisan. Some of them are with movement, some of them with not. I skipped something which maybe I'm not so ready to talk about. But the story about the jar doesn't get the main stage again, at least from my perspective, until the late Iron Age. And here I'm presenting a paper that we hopefully will publish it this year. This is part of a big ISF grant, won by Ayelet Gilboa and Gunnar Lehmann, dealing specifically with questions of South Phoenicia. Transport jars are a big part of it. Golan Shalvi and Ayelet Gilboa, and later Gunnar, with all of us, have published a very, very specific typological development of these jars. My role was to explain about the production. Where were they produced? And for this end, we've sampled from 17 different sites, many hundreds of vessels. We tried, not always with success, to select the ones that have a clear typological context, the ones that have a clear typological shape so that we can understand and attribute to one of these TJs. A context that is very, very clear also, not always the case. To answer this question. When I started seeing the preliminary results of all of these analyses, I was very intimidated, and it took me a long time to figure out how even to address this issue. There were many talks over these last few days bringing in petrographic results, as if this is a clear-cut science, as if there is a machine that we bring in a question and get an answer. This is not the case. We are as good as our reference collection. Luckily, in the last decades, 2 decades, there is so much information being published. More information being published, especially with petrographic analysis, the more we can do. And this is bigger than one person. This is bigger than my own job and my own reference. I'm bringing here a map from the LCP, the Levantine ceramic project. And this is a map that I just pulled out last month, asking it, I entered the question, please bring up everything which is Iron Age as reference. You can see a lot is going on. Another way to address these questions of reference is looking into the local geology. And we do this by ever-growing and ever-expanding geological surveys, where we collect geological references. Sorry, I am the last one, and I also feel the bit. Where we collect geological samples, bring them to the lab, experiment on them. We produce thin sections, we fire them in different temperatures, produce thin sections of this as well, run them through a method called FTIR, which helps us both characterize the mineralogy and also assess firing temperature. It is very accurate for this and very helpful. And the more we collect, the last 6 years in Tel Aviv, a lot has been done, especially thanks to all of these Tel Aviv students and scholars that came and collaborated with me, and the work became much more substantial and allowed me finally to address the question of this production of the Phoenician jars. It is especially complicated answering these questions of provenance in regions such as the coast, which are so susceptible to changes. Now, of course, I am a ceramic person. I study ceramics. I do not reconstruct environments. Still, I have to take into considerations a little bit of sea level changes, not so much. The main change that has gone through our coast and still going on today is the sediment transport. I've just wrote down the amount of sediments arrived from the Nile to our coasts every single year. This is an old article published in the 1980s. Since then, a lot of geological reconstructions have been done, different studies. And what I'm showing here in the map, before everybody points out my mistakes, it's not an accurate model. This is a thought experiment. What happened if I place graphically on a map the results of the different studies conducted along the coast, specifically around Jaffa and the Carmel coasts, other places, the geological map, specifically with its Kurkar ridges, which are elevated from from its surrounding. And I bring in the models of sediment transportation, which different studies from recent years have shown so much of this sand is really new. 1,000 years, 1,500 years, 2,000 years, different dates. Some are even newer. And I thought it will be an interesting thought experiments to show this, to explain the complexity of understanding both trade system and also expecting me to offer provenance to an environment which no longer exists. And this possibility was especially researched in the last few years from the University of Haifa and other groups in the Akko Bay, which is very relevant to our study. So to be able to answer these jars, which has been on my desk for some years before I allowed myself to actually finish the paper and move on with its publication. Thank you, Ayelet, Gunnar, and everybody else for their patience. I was just not ready. The more I studied, the more complicated the picture became, and the harder it became answering it. One thing that was clear as I was collecting the sediments and conducting the experiments is that all of them, or many of them, even though in sites that are very deeply inland today, have pieces of loose marine life. I don't know how old it is, it could be Pleistocene, but it still is there. It is very important because we keep seeing it in the pottery or in the jars, not in the bowls. I was also maybe naively assumed that to get better acquaintance with the jars, maybe I should also look at other forms. This is a very common practice in petrography. If you are interested in provenance of one specific type, it is very good to sample the entire assemblages and target vessels that are not likely to be moved. And it was partially successful because I could see that each or the sites that we analyzed open shapes from are not all, it's not always the case, but some balls did obviously move, but gave a very clear picture of how local mud would look like in the pot. But it was not the same as what I saw in the jars, which kept the question still open. Eventually, I've decided to divide, and I'm showing here already the results, my findings into four petrofabrics. And these four petrofabrics are, I am still not sure if they are worthy of the name groups. They do match their geological surroundings, which changes. The southern Akko Bay is more of a sediment trap. The northern Akko Bay up almost until or halfway to Tyre, about here. How to place it have mainly sediments derived from the Western Galilee. Then we have beautiful young marls, very golden, produce beautiful clay. We've seen it several times during this conference that are very typical to the southern Lebanon, and other late Cretaceous formations that, which is mainly shales and quartzitic sandstone. Very confusing to petrographers but can see in a bit northern into Lebanon. I've placed the results of about 230 of the many jars with samples within this model. We will publish the rest, the ones that don't exactly fit the typology and the ones that we are not sure, maybe they have a wider chronological range, and also the ones that I'm not sure about their petrography. We will publish them separately. They don't really change the picture, which becomes very clear. The earliest form, TJ1, is, and this was a surprise again to us, is produced mainly in the southern Akko Bay. That's it. I'm not talking about this distribution. It is found everywhere. It is found in Egypt. It is found in Cyprus. My map only includes sampled sites, not distribution, just to be clear. But its production is really rather limited. When we move on, and I brought here the next in line, TJ2, we already have very similar shapes and production everywhere. I was saying I'm hesitant to write them off as groups because of the so much variation within each group. I wouldn't be able to, because of this difference, I wouldn't even be able to assign them to a site. They are also very different to the balls. What they do find, and this is regardless of the petrofabric, whether it's the Akko Bay, south or north, or Lebanon, all throughout we find this evidence of this marine animal in the jars. And this is consistent. This is regardless of provenance. The jars show this repeated evidence again and again and again and again. And a variability, a very big variety of possible clay sources, not necessarily connected to archaeological sites. It's difficult to interpret. I was also given a chance recently by Daniel Master to look at images, and I will get of one of the most famously known example of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of TJ tools were found in the shipwrecks or in the waters of Ashkelon, possibly interpreted as shipwrecks on their way from Phoenicia to Egypt. Petrographic analysis showed the same pattern, the same variation. Somewhere within the Akko Bay, maybe north to that. I don't think there are two alike. There are more than one region of production needed to fill up this ship. How many? I don't know. More than one, more than two, more than three. It looks like as to fill up these ships, you would need a collection, as if the ship went from harbor to harbor to harbor to fill up the cargo and move on. I played with ChatGPT and asked him, how would it look? Yes, I couldn't for the life of me get him to reproduce the shapes. But I asked him how, just to get a sense of scale, how would it look like if Elisha and Tanit, the shipwrecks from Ashkelon, actually arrived to Egypt and needed to offload their cargo? Just to get a sense of scale, how many will it be? And it's a lot. I'm not making this very interesting, but I am trying. The story is repeating itself with the different shapes of TJs. I will not get into every single one. Some of them are more localized, some of them are very wide. We also see when we get to TJ9, the last one or the one that gets later within our chronological sequence, that there is no longer a production in the southern Akko Bay, the region of the Kishon, which Carolina talked about it earlier, and it goes further into the northern Akko Bay and into Lebanon. I will start my conclusions. What we see here was a surprise. This phenomenon of these TJs, first of all, are all actually Phoenician. Somebody asked me before, this becomes so obvious to us, they were all Phoenicians. Not a production of we were surprised to see that the TJ1, the start of this phenomenon is in the Akko Bay rather than Lebanon. We were sure it was Lebanese. It had to be Lebanese, but no, it starts more to the south and then expands. FTIR results are the contrary of what we've seen in the petrography. It was difficult to find two alike. FTIR results were very uniform. They were all fired in very similar low firing temperatures, which actually I'm thankful for, because it allowed us to see all of this maritime life surviving within these jars. And it's hard to ignore this pattern because it is so repetitive. It's very difficult to rule it out as something that is not significant, particularly because of the changes. There are different production between the jars and the balls. I think these jars were made in harbors. We also see, as we go on with the chronology, and adaptation in capacities from bigger ones, they become smaller. I didn't speak about distribution here today. I only showed the sampled areas just because they arrive everywhere. It's a maritime phenomenon, but it's also an inland phenomenon, at least in the later periods. One of the most interesting published sites of these recent years when it comes to this production of Phoenician jars was found at Tel Burak some years ago, and it was linked to an oil press, and it was linked to other facilities, olive and other facilities to produce agricultural products. We've discussed before, it came up in the discussion, possibly maybe because I brought it up, where does all these products grow? And I assume, or it doesn't make any sense, and nobody has ever claimed that all of the grapes needed to fill, all of these jars needed to fill all of this demand by so many possibly different sites could have grown on the Kurkar ridges and the sands of the coasts. They had to come, and we could see that they had arrived to the coast and transformed from grapes, olive, whatever, to the product being shipped outside. Not surprisingly, most of the jars from Tel Burak, the production center, are local. Not surprising also, most of the jars of, there were so many different shapes produced at Tel Burak to be shipped out, probably as part of this bigger system. If I would have to interpret this, I would also bring in the seasonal factor. To whoever knows our coasts and our seas, this is a very difficult environment to live and work throughout. And also the nature of this economic activity has to be seasonal. The harvest is seasonal, the sailing is seasonal. So who knows? Maybe the habitation is seasonal. Maybe this production of Phoenician jar is not a site-related production. It could have been done in, this is Sidonian estate is not my interpretation, it's the excavator's interpretation. Maybe it could have done either in estates like this or temporary settlements along what used to be the coasts. I don't know, I'm just offering my interpretation. If you would ask me, from the perspective of this research I've just shown, could we discuss Phoenicians or identify the Phoenician identity in the making? I would say absolutely.
Thank you, Paul, for this very interesting talk. We only have time for one question. The rest at the coffee break. Anyone? So let's go.
Yeah, and you later will watch it.
And we see for that.
Okay, so everybody, welcome to the final session of the conference. I would like to while all the organizers are here, I would like to thank them, perhaps jointly, for organizing such a beautiful it was really a pleasure and very well organized, and I think that we heard many new and intriguing ideas from the history of research and how Phoenician identity to a large extent is a modern construct, although we'll qualify that in a minute, about Phoenician. We heard that the Phoenician style of ivory carving is not really Phoenician. We heard that purple dye, which we usually associate with Phoenician, is not really Phoenician until and really it was we talked about various aspects, and of course I have to be now in the final session I have to be a bit more provocative, so that all of you stay awake, hopefully, because it's already quite late in the day. To a large extent, it's very easy to discredit this Phoenician identity and say that there was nothing like a real Phoenician identity. But I think that when we do examine the sources, and even, let's say, the classical sources, we see that Phoenician identity was not, or at least Phoenician cities do not have only their own identity, but we approach something quite broader. For instance, we have, if I'm not mistaken, points from Sidon, describing Sidon as the mother of Carthage, Kition, Hippo, and Tyre, actually. So it seems that why not? Yeah. So it seems that there was something a bit deeper in this identity that really connected various cities into a certain unit. And I think that we'll start with our two classical members here, and I'll ask you can you describe in a positivist or positivist way what was actually what it meant to have a Phoenician identity, or what type of identities did we have in those periods related to Phoenician cities?
Okay, so it's good that you are starting with me, because I also have a few questions, but I think that the issue here in the conference, we have heard more than 30 talks, and most of them dealt with the early or late early iron, and the beginning is the real difficulty, and once we are in the second half of the first millennium, it's much easier, because we have let's say the definitions or the collective science of mutual urban identity. Coinage is one example. Script, very defined, 5th, 4th, 3rd century Phoenician script, and other let's say artifact of material culture that are purely Phoenician in the sense. So there is an identity that means that we can define something as Phoenician based on basically this let's say this definite artifacts, because basically they speak in one language and they're supposed to provide some sort of a shared collective identity to those who use them. But when we are dealing with the Iron Age, I think it's another issue, because everybody use here Phoenician, everybody use here local, and I think that among them many different speakers, everybody has a different category, explanation, description, definition of what is Phoenician. In the early Iron Age, okay, for example, why Shikmona should be Phoenician, I don't know. For example, why you said
Ayelet actually said that she thinks it was back then part of the kingdom.
no, but not there. But later it is Phoenician. Under Assyrian rule, you see the something Phoenician. No? Okay.
Is this question?
No, I think this was the idea, but yeah, and then the same goes for local. What is local? I had almost in every talk, what is local? Locally produced, is it inside produced, is it regionally produced? There are many questions, you know, that need to be more pinpointed when we are speaking about identity, that in the classical period it's less problematic in a sense, because we have other means to define. So now you can answer and ask questions, maybe develop this session.
Well, I am going to speak a little bit like an outsider, because I am a classicist. And to me, it was a surprise a few years ago, not many years ago, when I realized that there were other peoples in the Mediterranean besides the Greeks and the Romans. So I am a newcomer, enthusiastic though. And I have to say that one of the things that surprises me, and actually coming from my field, from classics, is the notion that is now, I think, almost a consensus, that given that we don't have any sources by Phoenicians themselves defining themselves as such, then we shouldn't speak about an unexistent or about an unexistent entity. And it is surprising to me, because I don't think we would say the same about the Etruscans. I don't think we know how they defined themselves. And in Etruscan studies, I think they are reasonably happy to think that they existed as such. So I think the over preoccupation about Phoenician identity, the fear to speak as if they were an entity, is not an entity, but a concept that could be historical, even if we don't have the ethnic view about it. So that's something that I thought of during the last 3 days. Other than that, I am interested in poetry, and I need the Phoenicians to be around and sing and tell stories. And to me, the language is enough to do philological work. So yeah, the language is something that is an identifier. Regarding identity in general, I think we should keep in mind the possibility that people have multiple layers of identity. And yeah, and yeah, that's pretty complex. I don't think I have any more to say.
Okay, thank you. Yes, now I can. Yeah, but now when we move, let's say, to the Iron Age, which was probably the most discussed period during this conference, and when we, for instance, look at some textual sources, we commonly see the term Sidonians to some extent, maybe interchangeable with the Phoenician of the Lebanese coast, at least. We hear, we see that in the Book of Kings, for instance, 1 Kings 5, when we hear about the relations between Hiram of Tyre and Solomon, we hear that Solomon expects from Hiram to send him some wood, because the best woodcutters are Sidonians, although Hiram is the king of Tyre. And we have also other inscriptions, for instance, in the Masol, where once again we hear about the king of Tyre as the king of Sidonians. So if we talk about the Sidonian entity, how large was it? How can we describe it? What are your thoughts about it? What would be its boundaries? Was there really a period when Tyre subjugated Sidon, or was it more of a literary term to people? Alex, what is your opinion about that?
I think that people who excavate there, they have no opinion about that. They keep arguing if there were periods that Sidon dominated Tyre, and there is a period that Tyre dominated Sidon. So there are the problem with inheriting problem with the Phoenicia, the heartland. All of us, we know that, is that we are talking of urban settlements that exist for millennia. And the excavation of Tyre, like Bikais, which became Bible for all those who excavate Phoenician colonies in the West, we are talking of 6-7 squares. That's the exposure they have. In Sidon, it's a little bit better now, but it's still far from perfect. So this is the fact, very well known, that Ayelet, I think she is the major proponent of let's say Phoenician studies of the early Iron Age in Israel, and she pointed a long time ago. I hope I'm not deliberately mistaken your views, that if you want to study Phoenicia, actually in the southern Phoenicia, the outskirts of Phoenicia in Israel somehow gives us more picture about what happens in Phoenicia itself, because we really don't know what happens there. It is not yet properly excavated. That's the problem. So we have a few cemeteries, of course, here and there, like Elbas, etc. But we don't know about them that much. So that's a bit a problem. And of course, we can argue that there were periods that Sidonians expressed the royal, let's say, the hegemonic power on Tyre at certain periods, and perhaps it changed somewhere in the 10th century. It was all discussed on many occasions, but by Obed and many others. But again, in the absence of proper archaeological excavations in major urban centers in Phoenicia proper, that would be very difficult to answer. So no, later let me go operate.
Maybe I'll just add two biblical comments to that discussion, and maybe then if I may react to something to the previous topic. First of all, I think it's a fact that Tyre and Sidon are the most Phoenician cities that are mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. So from the Hebrews' point of view, they don't think about the Phoenicians as the people of Byblos. They don't think about them as the people of Arwad. I mean, although they do know these cities, but they do take Odor, right? But they do take Tyre and Sidon as the people epitomizing what we call Phoenicians. On the other hand, I would say the major term, ethnic term that designates what we call Phoenicians, or something that comes close to it, is Canaanite. And the Canaanites, of course, the term Canaanite appears in the Bible in more than one sense. It may designate the whole people residing in the land of Canaan prior to and even after the settlements of the Israelites, but there are also specific usages referring to the northern Canaanites. So this is how the Bible views them. They views them as, I would say, the people identified as the people of the land prior to the settlement of the Israelites, that are especially associated with the coastline and especially with the northern coastline. So we need to keep that in mind. I mean, of course, it's an outside view, but still, it's people who live quite close by. And this leads me to the second comment, which refers back to the issue of identity. I think that, first of all, I very much concur with what Andrea said, that people hold complex identities with more than one component and more than one layer, and these can also sometimes be conflicting. We have to keep that in mind as well. But I would also make the comment that I think that people resort to definitions and terms often that epitomize these definitions in polemical contexts. People assert identities when they face a challenge to what they consider to be their identity. This is usually when people crystallize their notion of identity. So I think that part of, and this also, by the way, applies to the Israelites, the biblical Israelites, who assert themselves vis-a-vis the Canaanites. So I think that, and the Greeks, of course, etc. And it's not a coincidence, as we heard today, that in Philo of Biblos, there is a notion of the Phoenician, which is being established vis-a-vis the Greek identity of this space in this time. So when we speak about Phoenician identities, I think we need to keep that in mind, that the real question, I guess, is whether there were such context of conflict that motivated this sort of self-identity assertions. And this, by the way, also applies in a way to the question of poetry. So because poetry and the notion of Phoenician are labels. There are labels that are partly motivated by internal motivations and partly by outside view. And just as I would refrain from saying that there is a black and white picture of Phoenician, non-Phoenician, I would say that poetry and prose are not mutually exclusive. It's like the two poles of a longer continuum, and we need to think along, as Brian has said, poetic, more and less poetic elements, rather than just doing a dichotomous picture.
Whether to ask.
Okay. I just want to say a few words and then we can open it to everyone else. I think that we need to separate myth versus realia. And realia, of course, is dependent on the archaeological data, which is far from complete. And the textual data that we don't really have for the earlier period. And so I think in terms of realia, as an archaeologist, I think there's a shared material culture in the coastal plain. And I want to call it Phoenicia as a region. This is what I want to call it. Sorry?
Which coast?
More Lebanon and not in the very beginning. And I understand where you're going with the material from Dor that really adds another very early layer to the Phoenician story. But in terms of 11th, I don't know, let's say 10th, 9th centuries, I want to go back just a second to the Lebanese coast. There's shared material culture as far as I know. And I want to separate this from the myth. And I take you back to Alex's talk about the perception that the Phoenicians are these, elevated craftsmen. And they might be very good woodcutters. This I can believe. But other than that, I think they represent the crafts that are going on in the wider region in the southern Levant. Bronze working, as Tila showed, is very widespread, as is iron, bloomery iron production from the 10th century and on. The Phoenicians are the ones, Phoenicians meaning the coastal people that are the tradespeople, the ones that go and search for foreign lands. They transmit this knowledge, which is not only theirs. It's a wider knowledge of bronze working and other crafts. Some of the crafts, as Marian Feldman told us, have no antecedents in the Southern Levant at all. But some of them do. But again, it's not the Phoenician coast. It's something much bigger than that. And this is the first instance where I really realized this was when I was working on the faience head. If you know the bearded male that we found at the Bel Bet Racha, this is quite a large, more than 5 centimeters head made of faience. And I searched for comparanda. Debbie Bellamy searched for a long time for similar heads made of faience for the technology. We also we did some scanning, 3D scanning, not a 3D
Scan.
head CT. This is what we did. We took the head to head CT, and we really saw the way that it was produced, and we looked for parallels, and the parallels that we found were inland, not on the coast. And this is true for many, many artifacts. It's faience production, and it's glass production, and it's metal production. It's a lot of crafts that do not exist on the coast, but rather inland. So the Phoenicians are the reflection. They're the ones to transmit whatever they are transmitting. But I don't think exactly. And someone said the word agent. I think it was Ifat Erani. She asked the question. She said, can we call them agents? Yes, we can call them agents. But again, the myth went much beyond what the Phoenicians had transmitted. And this is something which is an interesting phenomenon. How did they come to be the parents of all these technologies, Iron Age technologies around the Mediterranean? There is a reason for that. And I think, again, I go back to Alec, something about the stimulus, you know, that they stimulate production, they stimulate work, they encourage the local populations to go after all kinds of ore deposits that no one knew how to work with. So it must be an innovation, and these people have a role. But I was I'm still very intrigued with the DNA study, because the fact that we don't see any Canaanite DNA, which of course could be a bias of what was sampled, but it could tell us how big the phenomena was actually was. And it may not have been as considerable as we think. And of course, we will have to wait and see. But I think it's a matter of perspective. You know, the Western societies looking back east and seeing all these changes that are occurring as a result of this interaction with the Levantines, they see them. I don't know if they call them Phoenicians, but later on they do. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. It doesn't matter. They're looking at these people who are the tradesmen, and which are representative of a Levantine culture. And I think this is their perspective. Our perspective, and this is something that I want to ask Noam, is that of course when the Israelites, you know, when you read in the Bible that they are seeing the Phoenician as the other, and of course the question of the date, when exactly do they see? But this is sort of our way to define what is Phoenician, because the limits of the Israelite territories may be something more easy, not easy, but something that we can think about.
Oh, yeah, now you.
Now I'm not sure where to start. First of all, let me talk about the concept of the coast.
Hold it close.
This is close enough. First of all, we have to think about, let's try not to use Phoenician for the Iron Age for a second. So in the Bible, we're talking about the Phoenicians of Tyre and Sidonian. The obvious question, of course, has to be, when were the texts written? Because of course, if Sidonians appears in a text written in the Persian period, then it's logical. So there's no way to discuss this issue without discussing first the date of composition. It's one thing. Okay, so we keep ignoring this. Everyone, I mean, this is, you know, one of the elephants that has not been discussed here, apropos the Bible. One of the this is one comment. It's a big elephant. A layered elephant. The other thing is regarding what Naama said, the concept of the whatever Phoenician coast. We have to remember that most economic endeavors were conducted by specific polities. We can now see it when after the apropos Sidon, much of the Sidon material has already been published. It's amazing to see how Sidon is different from Tyre. Tyre and Dor are very close to each other in their material culture, especially ceramic, and in economic endeavors that are represented by the ceramics. The Bicron phenomenon and the connections with Cyprus that it demonstrates, the Egyptian pottery, the Cypriot pottery, and even the mundane pottery. If I would have seen Tyre, Dor, and Sidon on paper, those put Dor near Tyre and Sidon somewhere far away. And this is why, if you look at the last Sidon records, they had no idea how to date their Iron Age sequence because it doesn't. I mean, they couldn't use Tyre as an anchor. So it's not the coast; it's specific nodes that we have to understand. Now, as at least I see today, when I wrote about the Phoenician process, and this is why I call it Phoenician process, and I wrote that it's not that I'm using the term Phoenicia and arguing that actually we cannot use this term. One of the readers told me you cannot eat the cake and have it and keep it have it whole. And I said this is exactly what I'm trying to do, because what I try to do is to outline a process at the end of which the southern Lebanese polities became the prominent agents of whatever expansion. Now, by the way, it's not surprising that the Bible mentions Tyre and Sidon because these were the closest polities. This is obvious. Now, I think that the Phoenician commercial identity really started on the Carmel coast. The fact that we see this phenomenon started early on the Carmel coast is not only an outcome of the more extensive excavations in Israel than in Lebanon, but I will not expand on this. But from the beginning, apropos again, the Phoenician, what the Phoenicians are, the Phoenician phenomenon starts as an agricultural phenomenon. To my understanding, it starts, Sila talked about, it starts with commercial relationship with Egypt and with Cyprus. It starts because Egypt needs to receive whatever it received in the Elbe through booty and other impolite actions. Someone needs to supply Egypt with what it really needs. And archaeological evidence shows that the first to actually fill in the gap were Carmel Coast parties. The Lebanese one joining in shortly after that. Now the question is, these people that lived on the coast, they had a different, to my mind, totally different worldview than people living in Medina. Yeah. You know, they knew of far away places. They probably had agents in far away places. In Cyprus, we see it on the pottery. There's an ongoing discourse in the decoration of the pottery. They were living in another world than Megiddo people. Does this mean that they had another identity? Does this mean that the person, this is the difficult question. Does this mean that a person living in Dor and at Tyre knew that they are, felt some common ethos? Because, for instance, the sea, you can perceive cross-culturally. Engaging with the sea creates totally different ethic. How to say it? But this is really, that's the difference. I mean, I think the commercial process is really easy, relatively easy to understand. Question of identity, I'm not sure. I think that the identity of coastal people was different than the rest, but there's no way for the time being that I can show it. And also, this is one thing. The other thing is that we have to my mind, take into consideration are the two breaks that undergo vis-a-vis commercial, maritime commercial activity in the southern Levant. One is the takeover by the Kingdom of Israel at a certain point in the 9th century, late 9th century, apropos, argued by El Shafat, which basically eliminates Dor as a powerhouse for commercial activity. This is what. So this is step A in the Lebanese polities gaining advantage. And the second one is the Babylonian conquest, which really destroyed here everything for about 100 years. And this is why I think we cannot talk about Phoenicians pre and post the Babylonian conquest are two different things. After the Babylonian conquest, it's a new mishmash. So it's a different thing. And from that point on, I think really we are all Phoenicians because people are coming. Someone fills the void from about 500 BC.
Okay, thank you, Ayala. And of course, one of the, as you said, probably the people who lived on the coast who had this coastal identity probably distinguished themselves from those living in the inland. But we must remember that at least at the dawn of the Iron Age, we had additional people living on the coast who did not become the Phoenician. We have, let's say, the Philistines or various sea people. We have the people who lived in northern Syria who did not develop such a developed network and did not establish cities abroad. And the question, of course, is what allowed the Phoenicians to become to reach those achievements while others did not. So
yes, what? I think that we have to zoom out because we are now to zoom in on Dor and Shikmona. Let's go zoom out to the entire Mediterranean. It's more a place at the moment, I think. So when we talk about Phoenician advance into the Mediterranean waters and to the west, we forget other people. So we have Greeks. We have Etruscans as well. I started with the Etruscans, in Campania.
They don't exist.
They do. Actually, there is the dispute between Dionysos from Halicarnassos and Herodotus, who they are. Autochtonic Italians or they from Anatolia, but we will not embark on this question, who they are, the Etruscans. Let's stick to Greeks and the Phoenicians, and the Cypriots, of course, are always in between. See that Anne is looking at me. Cypriots are always there, but two major players at the moment that I would like to mention. So the same thing is with Greeks. Before a certain period, there are no such a thing. There's no such thing Greeks. They never identify themselves as Greeks. The major watershed that occurs, and this is, I think, nowadays accepted by almost everyone, is that the major shift in the creation of Pan-Hellenic identity takes place only during the Persian period, following the victory of the Greeks from different places, Ionians, Dorians, Aeolians, fighting together against Persians, and despite everything, the odds were against them, they win. And this was the major boost into this pan-Hellenic identity, which is emphasized explicitly by Herodotus. What does it mean to be Greek? Common blood, but gods, the religion, and the habits, that we have in common, and language. Language, this is very, very important, of course. But before that, what we have? Before that, we have tiny instances of the initial crystallization of pan-Hellenic identity, and I'm talking deliberately now about Greeks because it is much better documented. So we have Pan-Hellenion, for example, in Naucratis, which is established in 570 BC. This is explicitly a sanctuary which was dedicated to the Hellenian gods and worshipped by Greeks, Ionians, Dorians, and Aeolians. And it is not surprising that such a sanctuary, and we don't have any parallel to this in the entire Greek world, dispersed even in the Black Sea and around the Mediterranean. It's only in Egypt, only foreign soil, under Egyptian protectorage. Maybe there is a Lydian connection. I will not embark into this now, but it is on foreign soil. We have something, the Olympic Games, But when you look at the list of winners from the Olympic Games, it takes time until the Greeks from the communities which were located far away from Olympia started actually participating in the Olympic Games. At the beginning, you see that it's very localized phenomenon, which is gradually spreads beyond the limits of Olympia region. So we see these bits and pieces of crystallization of Greek Pan-Hellenic identity before the Greco-Persian Wars, but only after the Greco-Persian Wars we see the real watershed, the real shift. And maybe the same can be also projected in a way on the Phoenicians, because as I see it, again, this is my view here, I agree with my colleague Oriental, that from, let's say, a Achaemenid period, I personally think that we can talk about something that would be considered as a shared Phoenician identity, maybe expressed by the elites, for example. This argument was put forward with regard to burial practices by Ellen Dixon in her excellent PhD, where she observed that especially in the Persian period, there is this common elite language between Phoenician burials, especially with regard to the elites. But I can bring another source here, is that Herodotus, he begins his inquiry with stating that Phoenicians, they are originally from the Red Sea. Somebody put this reference here. I remember during our conference, Red Sea, it is meant, of course, Persian Gulf, not the Red Sea that it is today. So it is very interesting because he says that as learned Persian tells us the origin of the Phoenicians, it's actually from the Red Sea. And we hear later, a few hundred years later, from Alexander the Great conquest and from his generals, then they pass through this area of Bahrain and around this area, they have islands there, Vad, Tyre. So there is something here happens here in the Persian period, and I wouldn't be surprised that we have this maybe in the Persian period once the Phoenicia is under the Achaemenid regime. Maybe there is an attempt of Phoenician elites to create this common mythical identity that originally they come from the area of the Persian Gulf, which is actually Persian Empire. So they nowadays, and they somehow related, and they promote and promulgate this myth of common ancestry, maybe during the Persian period only. So maybe we can somehow correlate it. But when we go earlier, into the earlier phases of the Iron Age, of course, all we can see the different identities, also expressed by material culture, as Ayelet says. Sidon is different from Tyre, I agree. And there were attempts also by Fletcher and others to identify maybe different paths of colonization, Sidonian colonization, Tyrian colonization. I don't know if it's possible, but what we do see very clearly is that we saw a lot of maps here showing our Phoenician diaspora, all the way to the Iberia and Portugal and beyond. But usually when I teach about Phoenicians, I always put another color, Greek colonization. And you see that this, despite the modern attempts, let's say, of post-colonial perspective, more globalizing perspective, globalization studies, to somehow undermine the problems that that Phoenicians and Greeks had, I still see this as something that was present. So when you see, where you see Phoenicians, you don't see Greeks. Where you see Greeks, you don't see Phoenicians. They usually do not manage well together. Sometimes yes, but in Sicily they constantly fight. And in Cyprus they fight. So of course, and also in Homeric epos as well. From the one hand, we saw here all these praises to Sidonian masterpieces and Sidonian women and craftsmanship, etc. But this is from Iliada. When you go to the later epos, to Odysseus, Phoenicians are greedy people. They are slave traders. They are really not nice people. And what happens here, I think that contrary to what Ayelet said, that Babylonian destruction was the major watershed, I think that the Syrian conquest of the Levant was the major watershed. Because before that, I can see them mingling together, let's put it this way. But following the Assyrian conquest of the Levant, of the entire Levant, and I'm talking here as archaeologists, I don't see any Greek pottery here at all. Greeks are not welcome here. Greeks are not here. Phoenicians, they are the agents of the Assyrian imperialism. Many years ago, Susan Frankenstein wrote this article about Phoenicians as the agents of Assyrian imperialism, Phoenicians in the far west. Now we know that they came there much earlier. I once hypothesized on behalf of Hazael, but maybe even earlier than that. But I think that still this notion of Phoenicians as agents of the big, again, agents, but of the big empires, this is something that still counts. And when we look at these emerging identities, as I said, in case of Greeks, we had these Naucratis, Olympic Games. I would say, I was always looking, where are the Pan-Phoenician sanctuaries? We don't have like Pan-Hellenian, we don't have Pan-Phoenician sanctuary anywhere. And suddenly I realized we do have them. And here I'm deliberately provoking all of you. Tophet, this is the Pan-Phoenician sanctuary. So we heard here about Joe Quinn's. I think Tamar Hodos mentioned this in her lecture. It's Joe Quinn's terminology, Tophet cycle. Joe Quinn's terminology, Tophet cycle. She says that Tophet cycle, the cycle of Tophet, the cycle of Tophet. So these are circle of Tophet. These are religious refugees, like Protestants, and they fled. They escaped the Levant area and they settled in the central Mediterranean. I don't know. Are they? They sit exactly in the center. They sit exactly in the center. This is exactly in the middle of this voyage between the Levant and between the far west. So once you go, all the way to the Spain, you sacrifice the kid, the firstborn, if it is born on the voyage, and that's why you have all the Dea Gravida in the sea. So I told you I will deliberately provoke you.
Well, I'd like to.
And all the way back, you still have these Tophet sites as Pan-Phoenician sites, perhaps of sacrificing the kids, the orphans, yeah, the newborns, whatever you call them. So you said it should be provocative.
Yeah.
So let's make it provocative.
Yeah.
So maybe there we can see something which is presumably the initial seeds of the Pan-Phoenician identity, So it is Tophet, 8th century. Why it's so late? Why it's late? 8th century. 8th century.
Let's estimate for a second how many babies
That's
were
only two out of
buried
six.
yesterday and
It's not one phenomenon.
Perhaps before that, before that, anyone else on the panel that wants to comment on Amalek's provocation before we open it up?
open it up and we'll
Okay,
get
so
back.
Farron,
Thank you. So first of all, thank you to the panel and thank you to the organizers. This has been a very stimulating conference. In case you hadn't noticed, I've been very stimulated. So I'm trying to, I'll try and yeah. So Shnia. So first of all, try and use the term Levantine. So we take Phoenician out of this, okay? We are talking about a phenomenon that you can actually trace back to, I think Anne Killebrew pointed this out, and many others in this audience, to the end of the late Bronze Age. So that's the first phase. You could take it back even further if you want, but I'll start with that phase, that transition from the end of the LB to what we would call the beginning of the Iron Age. And the fact that the sites along the coast of what now we call Lebanon are not destroyed is very important. And we have here in Eretz Israel, we have continuity in the Jezreel Valley, etc. But let's focus on the coast and think about the Levantine peoples who live on the coast. Because again, in the coastal areas, like at Akko, which I've now published, there is continuity. And that's the important thing here. There are changes elsewhere. Well, some of us know the scene, right? The area in the southern coastal plain of Israel has very big changes. There are peoples that I would call the Philistines and others would call the Philistines come in. They probably were mixing with local indigenous peoples, how they called themselves, the indigenous peoples, Miodea, probably Canaanim, but that's another story. So that's phase one, okay? So as we creep forward into the Iron Age, I would say that the second, and it's been shown, I think, again, there are people in the audience who have tested this, but if we look at it at a high level, the maritime trade that was so robust earlier in the late Bronze Age mostly collapses, but does continue in very limited fashion. So that we still have connections from Cyprus at the very end of the late Bronze Age with places along the northern Israeli coast and the Lebanese coast. And who knows, maybe even the Syrian coast. I'm less familiar with that material, at least at the moment. I worked on a synthetic treatment of this a long time ago, and I can't remember the details. So that's the transition from the end of the late Bronze Age to the beginning of the Iron Age. When you get into more robust phases a little bit later in time, in the proper Iron One, we have other phenomena going on with these coastal people, with these Levantine people. And I was just talking with Marion the other day at breakfast. Now, of course, her ivories are later. I guess more generally, those would be just generically Iron 2. I don't know if we have Iron 1 ivories, but I was asking her, can you differentiate a Southern Levantine style, a Central Levantine style? And when I say that, I mean basically modern day Lebanon for central, but you know, the borders, maybe the border goes down, the southern border goes down to Tel Dor. I don't know, Ayelet does, okay? But the northern border stops at Arwad. Not for the central Levant, but when you go above, I don't know, actually for the central Levant. And then you have area of the coastal littoral that is actually above Arwad. And that I would call the northern Levant or the northern Levantine coast. Okay, let's just pretend that that's the Iron One. When we come to the Iron Two, there's a completely different picture. And when you think about all of the political changes that are taking place, and no matter how you date it, sometime in the Iron Two, we get the development in the inland of territorial states. But the politics or the political framework on the coast, at least in the central Levant, and probably again down to Dor and up to Arwad, is based around the city-state. Okay, they never developed a territorial state. So just like Alexander, you, excuse me, so nicely described for Greece, which also had a city-state kind of identity. And I'm sorry, you're the expert, and I don't know, you said the Pan-Hellenic identity wasn't until quite late. I think for the entire Iron Age, there was no, and now I'll use the term, there was no Pan-Phoenician identity until quite late, until they started interacting probably with the Achaemenid Empire. So there are multiple phases here. So to use broad terms like identity and then pick evidence from Spain, and then evidence from Carthage, and also evidence from Tyre, first of all, you have to phase it. And second of all, you have to realize that it might be slightly different because of the phenomenon of the maritime expansion, not only throughout the Mediterranean, but also into the Atlantic coast, and not only just of Spain, but also of Morocco. So this is not only incredibly complex, it's incredibly large in terms of geographic territory, and then the other thing too is that, and we all know this factor, although many of you speak different European languages or read them than I do, but you know, there are things going on in modern times with excavations in Spain that you need a Spanish colleague to access because we all know it takes a while to publish, and then I don't read Spanish. So I'd either be reliant on Google Translate, or I could talk to Paula because she does. Do you understand where I'm getting at? This is such a complex set of phenomena.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
agree with you completely. And the only thing I wanted to say is that just in the continuation, and Paula, you mentioned her, is that perhaps the best way would be to concentrate. Naama was always in favor of these communities of practice. At the beginning, I was very skeptical about this term, but actually Paula has showed, has demonstrated us this slide of Tel Burak plaster installation, the winery, and they published quite a series of articles. It's 7th century though, it's relatively late, but they published a series of articles where they claim that there's a special community of practice that use grog. We all know what is grog, yeah? So crushed pottery basically, as an aggregate in the creation of this lime plaster. When I published, and Sam Wolf is sitting there, published as well a series of iron H2A wine presses from the central coastal plain, from Jaffa, Lod. They actually start even in the late Bronze Age already in Ashdod. They do not have crushed grog. They have a shell, crushed shell. And this is completely different way of making plaster in comparison to Tel Burak, for example. So this is what Naama always was talking about, that we should go maybe to this level of communities of practice that could be identified in pottery production, in plaster production, in metal production, of course, if I understood you correctly during the year that we spent together.
Okay, so we have time for a few last comments because our discussion already coming to conclusion. So, please,
Much has been said and very interesting interactions. I'm just going to throw out something that has not been really mentioned by any of us, and that is the script. And script, I would want to say, has a label. The famous inscription of Yariri or Yariris of Carchemish region there claims that he knows 12 languages. I don't care whether he knows 12 or not. It could be conventional number. Let's not get sidetracked with that. But he lists 4 scripts that he says he knows. And the first one that he mentions is the Tyrrhenian script. And this is right at the time of 800. So that means the script has been around longer than that. Okay, and it means then that at least as far as the perception of people in the northern Levant, there was a script that had its origins. Now, I don't think it had its ultimate origins in Tyre, but it certainly had a claim to be known that way. So the script and the language then are part of the culture and identity of a people. When I come to Israel, I mean, I remember, I start remembering certain words from years ago, but my Hebrew is pretty poor. But it's part of culture. And so I do think it's important for us to keep that part in mind. So that's all I really want to say, just to kind of fill in.
Yeah, no, but probably so.
Yeah, two quick comments. One about the layers. I think that's one thing that people, when they're talking about Phoenician identity, they get hung up on, well, they list long genealogies and they talk about city-states. So there isn't a Phoenician identity. They're not connected. I can have an affiliation. I can have a political identity. I can have a larger identity. None of them counteract or conflict with each other. You can have multiple layers. And so that's one thing that that argument I think is relatively baseless. I would think that in a moment, say the Battle of Karkar and the Aramaean coalition, there might be then a moment where southern Phoenician states might feel different than the northern Phoenician states. And there might be separate, the same way that there's an Ionian-Dorian conflict in Greek identity. You could imagine that there's different group identities in that time of conflict. This is based upon exactly what Alexander was saying, that these identities are in conflict. Or I don't know if it's Alexander or no, but anyway, that's layers. Second, colonization. I'm not going to enter the circle of the Tophet with you. And it's also not Jo Quinn's idea. She borrowed that from Italian scholars, so it's you shouldn't attribute it to her. But
So whose idea originally?
do you know who originally?
It's not important.
I can send it to you by email. The colonization, though, what we should think of, that's actually a moment of identity. Because when you leave with your group to another side of the world, and what do you bring with you? You bring with you your institutions, you bring with you your customs, your traditions, your gods. You set up a market in the center of town. You set up a Tophet, but also Melkart, Ashtart. You worship your gods. You write with your alphabet. That is a moment of identity because you're reproducing who you are somewhere else. And that parallels the Greek colonization movement. And that's not something that we've talked about as a moment of identity. But I think that parallel colonization movement is a very strong moment to think of for Phoenician identity, and that's it. I don't want to take up too much time.
Thank you. We have another question on that.
Sorry, I have to make a small comment because this conference missed the maritime side of Phoenicians. And I think that one of the most important things that we have to take in consideration as an identity are the harbors. The Phoenicians, we have to take in consideration that wherever they were colonizing, they went with the same kind of style of settling harbors. They took the headlands of peninsulas and that they were kind of divided by a river or what kind of other kind of natural site. And this way they constructed a kind of stronghold for holding the whole area. And if you look around the Mediterranean, we see that they carried the same type of idea of settling the harbors. And this is a very important identity of the Phoenicians. Look at Tyre. Tyre was the first type, Atli, Carthago in Spain, So all these areas, they should be considered. And also, I think that they also relate with the burials around the coast. So these two sites should be considered as a typical Phoenician identity.
Maybe it's too late.
No.
I just want to. I thought that one site that was not mentioned, I think, though I didn't attend all the lectures, is Arzil. I mean, we really miss a major excavation in Phoenicia, as we heard, but I think the cemeteries of Arzil, unfortunately, the mound is not almost not excavated, is not properly. But I think the rich evidence from the cemeteries. I happened to work there as a student in 1963 under Brausnitz, who called them, by the way, not Phoenicians, but Sidonians.
Yeah.
And maybe he was right, yes. He planned a large project there with the Italians. Unfortunately, all fell apart. But the cemeteries that were excavated by Ben-Dor, published by Michal Artzi, Brausnitz, Michal Dayagi, I'm sorry, Brausnitz, which are still unpublished, many of them. The Southern Cemetery was never published. And then Eilat Mazar, who excavated and published 2 volumes. In Barcelona, 3 volumes. And the Ifalchek, there's only the trench on the mound. This provides a major, large bulk of material culture. And if Eilat is correct in her chronology, we can see the beginning of the 2 Tzist tombs, which Eran Aryeh and Asaf published. In fact, I excavated them in 1963, which are, in my view, are late 11th century. Then comes the 10th century, the early phase of the cemetery, of the Northern Cemetery, with ashlar built burials, chamber tombs. According to the finds in the one that Eilat published very precisely, the earliest pottery there, in my view, is 10th century, maybe even, I don't know, beginning of the Iron Tomb. And then it continues to develop into the Red Sleeve, where the thin bowls, which we saw, talked about, Carolina talked about them, they probably begin already in the 10th century. Or even in its quantitative excavations that we did before, I think we can see their beginning in the 10th century BC. And later on, we can see the classic Phoenician pottery that Ruth Amiram called Arzig ware, you know, the trefoil jugs and the mushroom jugs, which appear in such a beautiful way all the way along the Mediterranean Phoenician colonies. You can see them in Northern Africa, you can see them, as far as I know, in Spain as well. So these are a kind of cultural markers which point to some kind of, let's call it, identity. Yes, Marian Feldman said that perhaps pottery will give us the answer. So in fact, I think that these types, these pottery types, in addition to many other pictures, Hannibal is called Hannibal, which is the West Semitic name worshipping Baal in the Roman period. So we have here these very long traditions which go back to the Levantine coast, to the northern Levantine coast. And this is, I think, the essence of what we call Phoenician. And also, I think we have to emphasize that after all, you said correctly, the essence of this culture is trade. And the import of metals from the West and so on, which gives the impetus to this colonization process, which is really an amazing process.
Daniel?
Thank you. We've seen basically in many of the lectures spotlights on points. I miss, I would say, the big picture or the textual picture, which might answer your questions at the beginning about the relationship between Tyre and Sidon and other city-states from the Assyrian perspective, from the biblical perspective, from the Persian perspective. So we did not, I think, touch enough on that. So we are still with many question marks on that. That is one thing. The second thing is that I'm definitely not an expert in archaeology, or I don't know anything about archaeology. But from what I understand, there is a continuity in the northern part of, well, can we call it Phoenicia? Or that area from Ugarit down to Go?
Not from Ugarit, from
No, not including
from
to.
Arwad down. It's a subtlety, but.
Yeah,
Ugarit is
nothing,
out-
I
is
say
too far
not
north.
including Ugarit.
Okay.
Yes?
Yeah.
Let's call it whatever it is. Well, you can argue with the Ayelet about that. Yeah, but Akko is a border in several texts. That is true. So in this area, there's, as far as I know, continuity from the second millennium.
Continuity into the first, you mean?
Yes, of course. From the second to the
It is
first.
postulated usually.
Okay.
But as I said, in Tyre, for example, it is all based on a very limited evidence. And even there, if you look very closely in the deposits, there is something in the big ice trenches that maybe there is something that the burnt layer, it's not, there is continuity in several places, but not necessarily in all things. It's
We
difficult
don't
to
know,
concentrate.
unfortunately. We don't know, unfortunately.
No,
But what I'm aiming at is next conference. Let's start with the second millennium and also include a bit Egypt and the term which they use for the northern parts of the Levant, I don't know where, which is Fenechu.
I was expecting from you for something else about Egypt. Because when we look for these bits and pieces of perhaps imagining Phoenician identity, I was expecting from you to say, Alex, why didn't you mention Phoenician graffiti or Phoenician soldiers in Abu Simbel? Because when you have foreign soldiers in Egypt, and they belong to foreign legion, led by Egyptian general, but they Greeks, Phoenicians from different city-states, they identify themselves, Greeks identify themselves from different city-states. But this is the ground for emerging Greek identity, Pan-Hellenic and Pan-Phoenician identity. The beginnings should be there in the foreign armies as well. So that's what I was expecting you
But
to
you
say.
know why I didn't
You're a
do it?
specialist for this.
You know why I didn't do it? Because I knew that you would raise it up.
Of course.
So basically, I'm for the next conference about Phoenicians, go ahead and also talk about second millennium.
Please.
My comment actually will each his area of expertise, but obviously I'm going to the Achaemenid period. And in the Achaemenid period, we need to realize that the Phoenicians really enjoyed a very, very privileged, I mean, unlike anyone else really, in the Achaemenid Empire position. And this external stimulus could certainly be a trigger to developing this pan identity. Now, they were certainly traders, but I think really what was unique about them is that they were naval traders. There were all kinds of traders, but they were hired by and seen by the empire as the empire's fleet. And that was extremely important for the empire, and that's why they for a long time they did not pay tribute. They paid tribute in ships. I mean, that was their tribute, the naval force. And until they rebelled under Artaxerxes III, which was extremely violent situation. But for most of the Achaemenid period, they were the fleet, and that is the way the empire defined those city-states, and the people participating in this naval activity was the way that pan identity would develop for others as well. I think.
One note, the fact that in the 2nd century CE, there is an attempt to define
Phoenician.
It means that something was there even in the 2nd century CE, and such an effort to create pan-Phoenician history. It means that they survived all the ups and downs of the Hellenistic conquest and the Roman conquest. So this should be better.
Thank you. And before we conclude, perhaps it's a good time to ask, when do the Phoenicians really disappear? When they get off?
They never disappear.
Yeah. Well,
Their language stops in the 3rd century CE.
Yeah, I want to address this point, but then perhaps make a more general point, which I think reiterating something that came up in different forms. First of all, I think that identities are, we said already, it's a rather complex thing, but they also have a rather strange quality of reappearing sometimes. And we didn't have a talk, I mean, among the many things that we didn't address in this conference, we didn't address the modern, really modern reincarnation. So we have the Canaanites, the modern Canaanites in the 1930s and 40s, the Neo-Phoenicians within the modern Lebanon polities. So these things, we see that these things, I mean, of course, it's not a direct continuity, but it is reasserted, reappropriated under different historical contexts, but there is something there. No, it's not that everyone would did assert this. So this is one thing that we need to keep in mind when talking about this very slippery notion of identities. But another element that I think was very important, and I go back to Naama's agents and to Aaron's nuanced, I would say, notion of the basis for identifying or of defining an identity. And your question about the harbors, and especially what Ami has said about trade, I think that we, and to connect that to what Lawson has said about script, what appears, and also if I connect that to, for instance, the image of Tyre in Ezekiel that I mentioned, which really the main emphasis is on merchandise that goes in and out. So, and what I think transpires from all these converging lines of investigation is that a key element in the self-definition of these people is that they perceive themselves as transmitters, mediators, we can say traders as well, of course, but transmitter of knowledge and goods. And script is another a manifestation of that, because script is, again, is a means of communication. So I think this is not a form of identity that we know from other people. It's not an imperial identity that asserts itself through imposition of power relation. It's something entirely different, but it is there. And I think we need to account for that in itself. I don't know if I managed to communicate what I'm saying clearly enough, but it's a very different form of identity, which is about creating a network that transmits knowledge and more than that. Okay.
I think I agree with everything you said. However, you're missing what I think is the most important component, the ideology and the connection with cult. And that was the most powerful transmitter and what really brought people together in some sort of shared feeling of community. So I think that's a really important element that I don't think was emphasized enough in this workshop or conference.
Okay,
Just target.
in every network and net, we have more holes than substance.
So I have lots to say, but I'm going to try and keep this short. So Noam, actually, here's something that is pan-Phoenician. Nachon from Ezekiel 27, the ship of Tyre. And you probably know about pay, so you can help me out. But the ship is built, but it's staffed by 17 people from many different city-states. So that's that's just a metaphor for the fact that these people who share, and I love this conversation, but we have to think of identity as being multifaceted, right? And so the religion was important. The script was important. The language that was spoken from that script was probably even more important. The ships that they built were important. The ceramics that they made were important, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to think of the assemblage and go beyond just the archaeological to also include philological and textual data. The problem is starting with biased texts that are so late that make claims that are built on myths and or polemics. So let's throw those out and build up from what we know is original. But yeah, it's just, anyway, I am happy to leave this conference calling these people Phoenicians. They might not have said that themselves. That's an outside definition, but we lack the data to, or there are hints of data. And I would love to hear from Daniel, maybe not today, but about the Egyptian evidence. Yeah.
So just let's run a discussion.
Igor, thank you very much. Thanks. Igor, thank you for sharing this last session properly. One or two final words on behalf of the steering committee. So we were thinking, what about the publication? We want to publish the results of this workshop as an edited book. So in 1 or 2 weeks, all participants will receive an email with instructions, deadlines, etc. We very much hope that you will be able to deliver your articles within the period of. No, we will try to be nice, but and of course it is obvious that not everyone will submit. But on the other hand, I will tell you a secret. We received many emails from prominent scholars of Phoenician scholars, let's call them this way, from abroad that could not join us because these are other reasons, doesn't matter, but they are willing, more than willing to contribute their articles to the proceedings. I will not mention name, it doesn't matter at the moment, but serious people as well. Not as serious as we are here, but no, because I have to give kudos to those who actually arrived. So please, let's do it. And of course, one thing that we cannot still promise which venue exactly it will be. There are many options. It's but we can promise for sure that it is going to be open access. Yeah. So this is very important nowadays. So it could be either on behalf of the Institute of Advanced Studies or Israel Academy or Tel Aviv University or Jerusalem. It doesn't matter. We will decide. But it will be open access, and we really would very much appreciate your contributions, because I think it would be nice to have it as a nice volume that will end this adventure. So you will receive the instructions. Another thing. We have to say thank you, of course, to the Institute for hosting us. We have to say thanks for the head of the Institute, who is now enjoying himself in Paris. Maybe he has us on YouTube. Who opened the sessions here on the first day. But of course, first of all, to Karen and Tehila. And Tehila is there. So the success of the conference, it's not us, yeah, we are just talking. They do the actual work. And I would like in particular thank to Pnina Manderson, because without her, we would be completely lost. She did all, as you all know, she did all the email exchanges and took care of everything, the hotel reservation together with Tehila, of course, and others. But Pnina was our contact, and anchor, so the anchor, yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much, Pnina. And I wish to thank to all of you who join us. I hear during the duration of this conference, I constantly hear, Alex, this is a great conference. I don't know if people say the truth or they just want to be nice. But I take the first line. I would say I want to believe that they say the truth, and that you have enjoyed yourself. And today we have a very nice dinner at for speakers and chair, and yeah, so at 6 the bus will take us. Nama.
I'll just say, so I want to thank also the conference is by the two groups, but really I wanted to thank Alex and Oren and Naama for taking the lead on this and allowing us to add the cultural and literary aspects, which, as you know, in the case of the Phoenician material is rather slim. I mean, we have to supplement a lot from the outside cultures and to integrate it into the more, I would say, substantial and firm basis of the material culture. So thank you to all three.
I want to add something that if any of you want to see something as close to Phoenicia, the northern coast, you're all welcome to join us at the dig in Abel Beit.
Sorry.